Okay, so now we're recording this event for instructional purposes, so it can be shared later on. You can change your name in your profile if you want to remain anonymous or not have your full name. Of course, if you're just not really chatting or anything, your name won't show up in the recording. Questions can only be posed through chat, so we'll have a Q&A section later on in this teach-in. And the chat, of course, during the whole event must be respectful. There will be no toleration of bullying, sexism, racism, homophobia, transphobia, ableism, or other hate-based chat, right? Also, there will be no spamming, no commercial advertising or self-promotion. And of course, the moderators have the right to remove any audience members that are breaking these rules, these guidelines, or disrupting the event in any other way. So just briefly, the format of the teach-in, I'll quickly go into the introduction of the event, how it came to be, who's going to be presenting. We'll go into the presentations by each of the speakers, some brief initial statements, and then of course we'll have a Q&A section at the end. So first, I just wanted to introduce the Asian Cultural Engagement Center, which is the sponsor of this event. It was created in 2017 due to the advocacy and efforts of the faculty, staff, and particularly the students of the APIDA community at Virginia Tech. The ACE Center advocates for its Asian Pacific Islander Desi American or APIDA community, as well as serves and educates all members of the VT community. And so the ACE is actually running the programming for the APIDA Heritage Month, which is celebrated here at Virginia Tech in April every year. So please check up for future events that the ACE Center is holding through their website or through their Facebook site. Just a shout out for upcoming set events every Wednesday from 3 to 4 p.m. There will be a virtual cafe hour. And if you wanted to follow up on that, please contact Dr. Nina Ha, the ACE Center Director at nha@vt.edu. And of course, all this information will be available on the site or at the end of this event. Finally, thanks to Nina, Jackie, and Silas for all the help in working on making this event happen. So now I wanted to go into just briefly introducing each of the speakers that will be presenting today in the order of their presentation. First, Dr. Lindsay Marr is the Charles P. Lunsford Professor of Civil and Environmental Engineering. Her research group studies contaminants in the atmosphere, and for the past 10 years has focused on airborne transmission of the flu and other diseases. Dr. Kevin Ko is an independent scholar affiliated with the Center for Southeast Asian Studies at the University of Michigan. He specializes in the history of modern Southeast Asia with a particular focus on histories of medicine, religion, and the body in late colonial Indonesia. He unfortunately couldn't make it today due to scheduling issues, but he kindly sent along a video for us to watch, and it's pretty interesting. Next, we have Michelle Kim, who is a Virginia Tech undergraduate studying English and is serving as a representative for the Asian American Student Union and Asian American Coalition, both of which are student-led organizations dedicated to promoting cultural awareness and advocacy for Asian Americans. Then we'll have Junwon Kim, who is a PhD candidate in the Department of Sociology at Virginia Tech. He also serves as a graduate research associate for the Laboratory for the Study of Youth Inequality. His dissertation examines how social actors draw racial meanings from language and vice versa. That is, how racial ideology is mediated by symbolic forms of racial structures. And Junwon's research interests centers around the subject areas of race and ethnicity, critical race theory, sociology, culture, and intersectionality. And then finally, we have Dr. Bikram Gill, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at Virginia Tech, where he is also a core faculty in the Aspect doctoral program. His research interests are generally situated at the intersection of international political economy, political ecology, agrarian studies, decolonial studies, critical race theory, and global history. So before beginning, I wanted to show a quick video because it's that kind of sets up the situation that the kind of conditions that this teach-in is responding to. So the teach-in itself is about a collective and public response to the rising anti-Asian and Asian American discourse and practices in the United States, specifically in the streets and all, but really at the highest level of government and the different authorities that we see. So the objective of this teach-in is to respond to these kinds of conditions by raising critical consciousness about what we can do in the VT community as those who are part of the Asian or Asian American community and their allies, how to think critically, how to engage with these kinds of anti-Asian sentiment. So I'll just play this clip real quick.
Lately, I've been losing sleep.
It would be an ad in the beginning here. This clip will show just a little bit of what's been circulating in the public.
Impacts communities around the globe. Here at home, Asian Americans are facing more than just the fear of contracting the virus. They say that hurtful and misleading language from our nation's leaders are now making things worse. Our Kira Phillips first brought this up in a story last week, and she now has this follow-up.
As Asian Americans continue to share stories of violence and discrimination, messaging from some of our politicians not making it any easier. From the Secretary of State.
Before I address the efforts that we've been engaged in to push back against the Chinese virus.
To members of Congress.
The culture where people eat bats and snakes and dogs and things like that, these viruses are transmitted from the animal to the people, and that's why China has been the source of a lot of these viruses like SARS, like MERS, the swine flu.
To the President of the United States.
And I'd like to begin by providing an update on what we are doing to minimize the impact of the Chinese virus on our nation's students.
These labels and titles continuing to trigger acts of hate across the country. Asian American outrage now trending on Twitter, reacting to the president's language.
Trump's comments, what it does is distance Asians from the rest of America or the rest of the world by targeting Asians and putting a face, a culture as someone or something to blame for this virus.
Sam Louie is one of those voices criticizing the president in his blog, saying by calling it the Chinese virus, he is perpetuating the fear, hatred, and in some cases, violence against Chinese and Asians worldwide.
I have to be extra careful that if I sneeze, because I know I'm Asian and more specifically Chinese, what are people going to think?
Asian lawmakers now united. New York Congresswoman Grace Meng concerned by the administration's messaging.
What do you want to hear from the president now that you have seen a spike in hate crimes towards your constituents and other Asian American communities?
I want him to call the virus by its proper name and not use racist tactics to divert from a lack of responsibility or a lack of responsiveness that we've seen from his administration.
California Congressman Ted Lieu in his op-ed for the Washington Post on Wednesday saying Trump's rhetoric adds fuel to the growing fire of hatred being misdirected at Asian Americans. The fact that he is the president of the United States who is responsible for the well-being of all Americans only makes his rhetoric even more disturbing. ABC's senior White House correspondent Cecilia Vega pressing the president.
Why do you keep calling this the Chinese virus? There are reports
reports of dozens of incidents of bias against Chinese Americans in this country. Your own aide, Secretary Azar, says he does not use this term. He says ethnicity does not cause the virus. Why do you keep using this? A lot of people say it's racist.
It's not racist at all. No, not at all. It comes from China. That's why. It comes from China. I want to be accurate.
About Chinese Americans
please,
in
John.
this country.
Please.
The aides behind you. Are you comfortable with this term?
I have great love for all of the people from our country. But as you know, China tried to say at one point, maybe they stopped now, that it was caused by American soldiers. That can't happen. It's not going to happen. Not as long as I'm president. It comes from China.
This isn't.
All right, so we can watch more, or you can watch more later on if you feel like it. But that just kind of gives you a kind of a framework of what we're actually trying to respond to, and some of the things that I wanted to have the speakers address, not just simply what's being talked about in the media today, or what Asian American community members are dealing with on the everyday in the public, but also just to give their expertise, their lived experience, and responding to how we can better think and act in this situation. So I asked the speakers to reflect on some of the following questions. First, drawing on your experience and your lived experience, on your expertise and your lived experience, what are the main points that the broader public should think about regarding anti-Asian racism and the pandemic? What should we be most conscious of during this moment in order to better critically think about media and other social network news sources? And then finally, what should we be most conscious of in taking care of those most vulnerable to anti-Asian racism in our local and transnational communities? So these are just some of the questions, some of the prompts for each of our speakers. So now I'm going to open it up, start the for the panelists to present their initial statements. I wanted to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Lindsay Marr.
Hi. So I'm an engineer and applied scientist. I'm not a social scientist, so I'm going to kind of try to stick to areas that I know. It turns out that I have studied transmission of viruses and droplets and aerosols for the past 10 or more years, mainly for flu, but also for other diseases. So my expertise is kind of in a bit of demand right now. So it's nice to talk about something a little bit different. Can you go to the next slide, please? If you are interested in airborne transmission, I have a publicly available narrated presentation on this that I promoted through Twitter that people have found pretty useful. These are the links. You can go to the next slide. But in thinking about this, this pandemic, I was knowing that many flus have originated in Asia, I decided to look into the origins, geographic origins of other pandemics. And so these are some of the big ones, like the plague, the Black Death of the 1300s, which we hear about mainly affecting Europe, but in fact, we're pretty sure that it originated in China. The smallpox pandemic is thought to have originated in India or Egypt, cholera from India, the well-known 1918 influenza epidemic, which is called the Spanish flu sometimes, is thought to have originated in Kansas, the US, or in China. Kansas, because it comes from, the virus is thought to have come from pigs, and there are farms there, and basically they trace back kind of some of the earliest cases in the US, and this was of course during the war, and a soldier had moved from there to some other fort base, I guess, in the eastern US, and it kind of spread there and then spread around the world. HIVs emerged in Central Africa. Ebola virus disease also emerged in Central Africa. The earlier severe acute respiratory syndrome, SARS-1, which was in 2002, 2003, is thought to have originated from China. And then Middle East respiratory syndrome is thought to have originated from Saudi Arabia. So I just wanted to put in perspective this kind of thought of, oh, where are the viruses? Where are these pandemics coming from? That's all I have to say for today.
All right, thank you, Dr. Marr. We'll have plenty of follow-up questions for you later on, I'm sure. And thank you for staying to the time limit. So, as I mentioned earlier, Dr. Ko could not make it to today's roundtable because of scheduling issues, but he did send this video for us to talk about. So Dr. Ko is a historian, and he'll talk a little bit about the disease, the way that disease and race are entangled throughout history.
So I've been broadly tasked with reflecting on the historical relationship between epidemic diseases and anti-Asian racism in order to give some historical dimension to our experiences with coronavirus. To do so, I'd like to start in the 19th century. There was, of course, scapegoating of various groups during epidemics well before the 19th century, but they weren't often directed at Asians, nor were they racialized as problems originating in yellow, brown, or black bodies and their bodily behaviors. Things began to change starting in the second half of the 19th century with two major developments: an expansion of European colonialism in Asia and Africa, and the rise of bacteriology via laboratory science. Indeed, what would follow, the Age of Empire and the Age of Germs, were entirely intertwined. They required each other to function, to develop. Networks of laboratories set up throughout the colonies to gather biological data of both local and global importance. And on the flip side, colonial governments relied upon epidemiological discourse to make sense of and justify the intrusions of European and American empire. As a historian of colonialism and medicine, I'd like to argue that this nexus of empire and epidemiology plays a central part in the history of anti-Asian racism throughout the 20th century and into the present. As a key turning point for both was the discovery of a new culprit for disease: germs, microorganisms, first bacteria, then viruses and microbial parasites. This led to a switch in both medical and lay understanding of the processes of disease towards filth, bodies, and bodily habits, towards a zooming in on bodies and thus a racial targeting and scapegoating of bodies as well. And it allowed Europeans and North Americans, particularly of the upper and middle classes, to locate new scapegoats for epidemic disease in immigrants on their own shores and in the distant peoples of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, who, because of inherited racial qualities and customs, were assumed to live in filth and squalor with little bodily discipline. This led to a new and powerful racialization of disease in the US and Europe. White people laid claim to being inherently cleaner, more disciplined, more modest, and more scientific than their brown, black, or yellow counterparts, who were seen as dirty, undisciplined, immodest, promiscuous, and unscientific, and ultimately incapable, in fact, of governing their own bodies and homes, let alone their own societies. These racial discourses intensified in the early 20th century and certainly continue to this day. Indeed, these prejudices run through the whole history of global health in the 20th century. Anti-Asian discourse in the US picked up on these themes as well. Derogatory images of Asian bodies and bodily habits proliferated. Now, the history of zoonotic disease is about as long as the history of human disease overall. Yet it perhaps plays a particularly pernicious role, this concept of the zoonotic, in derogatory discourses surrounding Asians and Africans, in Corona and in the case of Africans, Ebola, in recent memory. We get this idea that coronavirus emerged in significant part out of the strange and exotic eating habits of Asian people, namely that they eat strange and exotic things. More broadly, Asians were seen not only to produce filth, but in some ways to eat it. Right? They eat rats, cats, dogs, frogs, snakes, turtles, all sorts of vile and exotic things. In fact, because of these zoonotic connections, anti-Asian discourse surrounding these epidemic diseases often began to conflate the supposed human and non-human culprits alike, I would suggest. In narratives of the Barbary Plague, for instance, Chinese immigrants were often seen essentially as rats, portrayed as rats, filthy urban creatures, not only because of how they behaved, but for what they ate, which was always seen as sort of mysterious and exotic. Okay. Lots of people, of course, spread diseases. In fact, all people spread disease. The history of disease on a global scale has had as a core feature that we are all susceptible and we are all complicit, that it is human civilization itself, its affinities for sharing their spaces and bodies with one another and with animals that spreads diseases. We might also respond to anti-Asian sentiment surrounding coronavirus by laying bare how often in our history epidemic diseases have been used to blame and demonize not only Asian people, but also Black and other brown people, religious minorities, and queer people, indeed to dismiss and strip away their human freedoms and dignities. Finally, we might then zoom out to recognize even more broadly how the least secure people in our world and in our communities have almost always been the most vulnerable to disease transmission, infection, and death, and that this is certainly the case now with coronavirus. And thus we can challenge anti-Asian discourse not only on historical grounds, but on social, political, and ethical ones as well.
All right. So I know out there, Kevin, if you're listening, thank you for that. The next speaker we have is Michelle Kim, and she's, there we go, from the Asian American Coalition and AASU.
Okay. Hello, I'm Michelle Kim. I am serving as a perspective for the undergraduate student and the undergraduate student here at Tech. So I don't quite have a PowerPoint or anything like that because I'm speaking from an experience, and I decided I couldn't really put something like a personal experience into really cute, neat slides. But so as an undergraduate student who's been involved in various aspects of Asian American student life, I've had the opportunity to talk with a lot of other Asian American students on their experiences with COVID-19. And so across the board, students have said that it's kind of a challenging time to be Asian American, even more so than usual, obviously. It's a little tough to do anything in public at the moment because of everything that's happening. And because of everything that's happening, I've had friends who have been making intense efforts of not wanting to be seen as ill or exhibiting symptoms of someone who might be ill. They've noted that while going out in public, they sense that people are a little bit more cautious of them than usual, or they automatically assume that they are sick. I've even had friends joke that they don't really want to speak their native language out loud or any language other than English out loud in fear that people will possibly target them or associate them with being a foreigner. There is this constant feeling of being watched and assessed, and people, just by looking at you and judging by your race, automatically assume or are quick to assume that you might be an active threat to their health. What the fuck?
Sorry, Michelle, I don't think your video is showing. That's why I.
Oh God, okay. Okay.
Or did you want the PowerPoint up?
Oh, wait, I'm so sorry. I just cursed on screen.
It's okay.
I just cursed on screen. Okay, I'm really sorry. That was really embarrassing. Okay, I don't know where I was. Okay. Okay. So essentially, basically, all of these sentiments of people being possibly targeting them or associating them as foreigner, you have this feeling that you're being watched and assessed, and people will automatically assume that you might be an active threat to their health. So all of these sentiments are, in general, pretty frustrating for a lot of Asian Americans whom I know, especially for students of Asian descent who grew up here, who suddenly feel like they have to prove that they aren't foreigners or non-Americans. Touching in with other historical points, Asian Americans constantly feel this idea that they're not American enough or they're not Asian enough to be represented in this country. And so when we're thrown this type of rhetoric that of you have coronavirus or go back to where you came from, these racial attacks make it very apparent that instead of being seen as Americans, Asian Americans are only seen as foreigners who pose a threat to Americans. So with that being said, I believe that there is a lot that people who are seeking to be allies during this time can do. One of which is please share social media responsibly. Whether you're sharing articles to Facebook or to friends and family, please be conscious of not only what kind of information you're putting out there, but also the images. When an article discussing COVID-19's cover photo is a person of Asian descent in a mask, that continues to perpetuate the idea that people who typically look Asian are the only people affected by this pandemic, which in reality, we all know that's not true at all. Secondly, this goes for faculty members or professors. I'd ask that you please check in with your students. I'm sure that you already are, but if your student happens to be of Asian descent, especially they could be dealing with the possible expectation that they could be targeted, their friends and family could be targeted, and or their businesses could be targeted. A lot of Asian American students come from immigrant backgrounds, and the possible scenario of your immigrant parents or grandparents who don't necessarily speak good English being physically or verbally harassed in public isn't necessarily an easy burden to deal with, on top of everything else that is going on. And thirdly is to please notify students what exactly Virginia Tech's resources are and how to access them. For a lot of students, tech is not only a home, but a source of income. Lots of students depend on their jobs at the university as a way to provide for themselves, especially for international students where home isn't necessarily a 2-hour drive away. The questions are, how is Virginia Tech going to help and cover those who depend on the institution for their livelihoods? And especially, who can students contact during this time? What are resources? How can we easily access them? And lastly, and most importantly, I'd say that the best way is just to support Asian Americans in any way you can, whether this includes not being a bystander when witnessing racial attacks. Don't support oppression by saying nothing when you know it is wrong. Even just standing by someone is a good way to be a bystander, is a good way to fight back against these attacks. And this also applies to acting as a bystander when a friend or family member encourages anti-Asian rhetoric. Be an ally by correcting this behavior. Bystanders can demobilize racist attacks by pushing against racist mindset when they don't conform to it. Support Asian American businesses. This includes shopping at Asian grocery stores or buying from Asian online shops. Continue to show support to specific restaurants and businesses. And finally, please donate to any Asian organizations doing work to support people impacted by COVID-19. Okay, that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thanks, Michelle. That was really great. Thank you for doing that. And a lot of eye-opening things you mentioned. And the chat is all with you right now. That's blowing up. So, and they didn't think you said a bad word at all. I don't think fudge is a bad word. The next speaker is Jung-Won Kim. And let's see if this works.
Okay, so I just wanted to thank the organizers for having this panel, because I think this is the critical point of intervention. And wanted to thank so far all the speakers. See, I'm touching my face right now and I'm self-aware of that. And I just want to start off by saying that I'm going to get technical a little bit, because as a sociologist of color, I don't think my knowledge production is separate from my positionality. So I just want to first jump into the notion of race as a social structure. It's not merely an individual prejudice that is, it's imperative to see this as a structural or systemic, which is a matter of definition, and not to pathologize racism in this medical discourse, because this is something that is endured, as Dr. Koo beautifully articulated, Like racism has a long history, same with colonialism, which is tethered to it. I mean, Western modernity as we know it is founded upon white supremacy. So that's the starting point. And I think another point to go on is how Yellow Peril is deeply connected to racial affect. That is this mobilization of white supremacist sentiments through these notions that are conjuring up emotions. So, you know, you have these words like Kung flu, Chinese virus, Wuhan virus, which I have actually seen this used in around chats among Korean communities. These are lexical ascriptions that will dramatically impact the lives of Asian and Asian Americans as fear will continue to surge along with the increasing death tolls from COVID-19. And as we have sort of established already, the notion that, you know, this is President of the United States calling this the Chinese virus, it's an accurate description. Him saying that, I mean, that's having consequences globally, especially in terms of what I see as a xenophobic and this sort of fear, again, racial affect being mobilized as a political discourse. So that's another thing that I want to touch on. And to answer the third question, like, okay, how do we raise consciousness? Well, I think another one is to look back at history, and quite a recent history, and not exclusively to Asian Americans, but for example, I mean, you can look at the Holocaust, the discourse around Jewish people then surrounded again with the similar lexical descriptions of vermin, disease. I mean, this has existed for a while. And these signifiers have been historically used in a way to dehumanize the portrayal of the racial and ethnic group. So quote unquote, under question. And I would implore that we have an intersectional approach to who are the most vulnerable. And I hope to discuss that during the Q&A section. But again, the oscillation between this being mobilized as a political discourse and race and the discourse of race as a carrier of meaning that is done through emotions, and ultimately what happens on the ground, which is COVID-19, these things will continue to feed itself into a chain loop. So to disrupt that, I think this panel is a wonderful start. That's all I got to say about now. I know that was quite brief, but I hope to address this more in a dialogical interaction as we move into the Q&A. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Jungwon. And there's a lot of concepts there that Jungwon introduced that we definitely will probably have to tackle later on. And I think I see in the chat, there's already some folks who are already picking up on some of those concepts. So our last speaker with a prepared statement is Dr. Bikram Gill.
Thank you, Alan. Okay, so just want to make sure everybody's hearing me okay? Yeah. Thank you, Alan, to all the organizers. I concur, very important event. Very grateful to have been asked to participate. Going last, I think it's the case that a lot of what I was planning to emphasize has been emphasized, but on the plus side, I think there's a lot I can respond to and integrate that's already been said. I also wanted to begin kind of like Jungwon with a discussion on racism more generally, just so we can kind of recall what are we talking about when we're thinking about racism in relation to the contemporary crisis, but more generally, right? So race and racism is often understood as a form of othering and a form of power that relies on kind of biological distinctions, right? That there are, I mean, of course, now it's become more culturalized, but historically with scientific racism, that there are distinct, potentially biological differences between races, right? And this becomes a question of being or ontology as well, a constant suspicion towards the other. Are they really human? Can they be as rational as the full human, and the full human always being kind of the white European. The contemporary crisis is leading to a resurgence, obviously, an intensification of an ongoing form of racism towards Asian people and Chinese in particular. And this is the resurgence of the figure of the Oriental, right? Who was the construction of the Oriental has been a key kind of moment in the exercise of what I'm going to talk about more right now, which is imperial power, right? So there is obviously racial colonial power, but there's a geopolitical imperial power that the construction of the Oriental has been quite central towards. Now, the Oriental within this, in a racial sense, towards whom suspicion is cast regarding their humanity, is shifty, untrustworthy, despotic, right? Inherently authoritarian, a figure who you cannot trust, who may indulge in some of the practices that Dr. Ko had emphasized around eating exotic and unsafe animals. So that's maybe just to start with kind of that figure there. Again, it's at the border of being human or non-human. Now, there is an immediate function to this form of racism, right? There is, which is not just specific, should be emphasized, to the figuring of the Oriental. As I'm writing this, or as I'm thinking about this right now, there's increasing reports we're hearing about racist acts towards other groups as well throughout America, right? You're hearing people being attacked and told to go back home who are of a variety of kind of non-white backgrounds. There's an immediate function to this, of course, which is this obscures attention towards interrogating the role systems of power have played in producing this crisis. And it leads us to focus on individual and cultures and eating habits rather than systems of power, right? And so there's an immediate scapegoating function. And now how we can address this at one level is to emphasize, focus on systems of power. And I think something that Dr. Mar had emphasized can be very useful in elaborating this. There was an emphasis on different histories of diseases emerging from different parts of the world. But I noticed a couple of the examples, for example, cholera emerging out of India, HIV out of Central Africa. And there's an article that I would encourage people to look up. I will try to provide the link maybe afterwards, by Sonia Shah on The Nation very recently, which emphasized, rather than looking at an ethnic origin of a disease, we need to look at systems of power like industrial agriculture and the role this has played. Now, these earlier crises of cholera and HIV, Sonia Shah in this article emphasizes that these were not coming out of India. India was colonized at the time that cholera spread. So this was more a function of the British colonial states' reorganization of agriculture in Bangladesh, right? And how this led to the conditions for diseases to spread much more easily. Same with HIV in Central Africa. You can trace the origins to the Belgian colonization of the Congo. So, and now we can look at the coronavirus, and there's no conclusive evidence actually as of yet. We should be hesitant to speak in that terms, but it should more clearly be understood as an outcome of a global system of industrial agriculture that's been encroaching upon habitats of non-human animals, which allows for an easier spread or transfer, from animals to humans, which is not distinct to any one part of the world. This is a global production system. Okay, I'm mindful that I'm pretty much out of time. So where I wanted to kind of maybe end with, and this was going to be the heart of my comments, and I guess I should have started with this perhaps, but there is a deeper function of anti-Asian racism beyond just scapegoating. The historical function of anti-Asian racism has specifically been to attack China, actually. Western imperialism, at its origins, was about marginalizing China. The West was a periphery to the Chinese-centered world system. And the West always wanted Chinese goods, and the construction of the trope of Oriental despotism has its roots in 18th and 19th century European imperialism, has its roots in thinkers as varied as Montesquieu and Hegel, and they constructed this figure as the opposite to the Western liberal. So the Oriental, again, the Asian, is inherently despotic, authoritarian, cannot be trusted to be sovereign over such valuable goods and the circulation of goods, right? So this was the historical function. I think we have to keep that in mind. And China was subjugated, of course, in the 19th and 20th centuries, but in the contemporary sense, Oriental despotism and this trope around the authoritarian Chinese state that Trump and his contemporaries and his, I guess, his partners are promoting is motivated by a desire to once again marginalize the rise of China, okay? And I know, and I want to really emphasize this point because right now the increasing racism is often held to be separate from the hostility that is directed towards the Chinese state. Now, this is not meant to be then a blanket justification of the Chinese state, but it's just to be mindful of when we hear consistent, constant attacks on the Chinese state as being uniquely depraved, as being uniquely authoritarian, as being inherently despotic, right? That's the way even beyond Trump, the Western media has spoken about China. This is rooted in a desire to contain the threat that China poses to a Western-dominated system of imperial capitalism and the control of the West over the world and especially the global South's resources. The Chinese Revolution and China's increasing relations with Africa and elsewhere has really threatened that, right? So a lot of this constant narrative you see in the Western media of China, there's only 3 ways you can speak about China: big China, bad China, scary China, right? It has fed into a lot of what is happening right now. And it's really important that we keep an eye on the geopolitical origins of a lot of the racism right now, right? There's a purpose to this, and we see the way in which the geopolitical kind of attack that Western states, and particularly the US state, is launching against China. It involves a caricaturing of Chinese culture and Chinese communism that is similar to the way Islam and Arabs were attacked during the War on Terror. So as the US and other Western states will attack Iraq or Afghanistan or Iran, so do Muslims feel the brunt of this. So now the consistent and constant vilification of China's growing role in the world and its building of relations with African states and other states has a corresponding vilification of Chinese culture and Chinese communist history, right? So I think we need to be very mindful to not give a pass to that, because I think that has happened too much as well. And I want to conclude with an emphasis that in constructing constantly the Chinese state as uniquely depraved and authoritarian, we are not able to think about how one can learn from the experiences of China and the cooperative relations that China has forged with other global South states, right? So right now, as we speak, the states that are being sanctioned by the United States, such as Iran, which has suffered so much from the coronavirus, such as Venezuela, Palestine. We can't forget the Palestinians have been some of the most sanctioned and brutalized people by Western power. The Chinese have been sending aid and support to these places, right? And again, this is not a blanket defense. This is just the point that we cannot even acknowledge that this is happening because the purpose of speaking of the Chinese virus, the purpose of constantly attacking this is to continue to defend and elevate Western geopolitical power from the threat posed by the rise of China. So I'll stop there, and I welcome questions during the Q&A.
Thank you, Bikram. That was great. We got a lot of responses in the chat. Just really quickly, just want to thank everyone again, all the speakers for presenting such really thought-provoking content. This is the section that of the teaching that you've all been waiting for, the Q&A. I'm sure you're all just sitting on some real juicy questions for our speakers. They've introduced a lot of really interesting things to think about historically in terms of the social aspects, the political and geopolitical aspects, also what we can do on a very micro community familial level. Those are all things that were introduced. If we have any follow-up questions on the chat, we have Dr. Castanelli moderating it. If you would like to pose any questions, it'd be through the chat. If no one has any questions yet, I have a couple. One of the things that actually has emerged recently is sort of a counter discourse to the anti-Asian American kind of rhetoric. You have this new rhetoric of increased sort of like nationalism or patriotism coming out of different voices. So someone like the previous presidential candidate, someone who was running for presidency, Alan Yang, saying that just like the Japanese Americans during World War II, Asian Americans in the present should also go out representing American, the American nation even more so, to prove that they belong here. So I'm curious if any of the speakers had any thoughts on how this kind of rhetoric, this counter rhetoric, is playing out. How maybe you all would engage something like that.
Just to be clear, you're talking about, Dr. LeBeau, white nationalism in the US?
No. I'm talking about within the Asian American API-ADA community, those who are saying that we, Asian Americans, should be more nationalistic, should actually be more publicly nationalistic. For example, Alan Yang uses the example of all the doctors and nurses who are, if we look at the numbers, overrepresented, right? There's a lot more Asian Americans who are serving as nurses and doctors, medical doctors, than there are, percentage-wise, than there are in the United States overall, right? So we're overrepresented in so-called front lines of the coronavirus, and this is sort of, for him, proving the patriotism of Asian Americans. We also have other questions coming in. Actually,
this is Andrew Yang. Andrew Yang's recent.
Andrew Yang, sorry, I just gave him my own name.
On this, right? Yeah, I mean, I can answer if that's okay, or if anybody else. I'm also happy to wait if other. I think it's understandable if if people feel like they need to out nationalist or become bigger nationalists than even white Americans, right? To prove that one belongs more. This is often the first impulse that many kind of racialized peoples or minorities will feel. I need to prove myself even more, and but you're seeking the approval of kind of the white gaze, right? This is what it is. We're falling into this desire to seek to be approved rather than seeking solidarity with other kind of marginalized and oppressed peoples. And it's important to point out that action only works in a national register, right? The need for global solidarity to think about how this form of racism is operating again to secure Western geopolitical power. So acting like you are more American is not going to necessarily address the destructive consequences of American action on a global scale, right? So how will this address the sanctions that are being opposed? How is this going to address, again, the constant attempts to marginalize China from any participation in international forums? So I'd say it's understandable, but we need to be cautious against that and emphasize more solidarity with other marginalized and oppressed peoples.
Yeah, I do. If I could speak, is it okay? Yeah, everyone good? I just wanted to elaborate on that point, is that there is going to be, I mean, obviously, what we're gonna witness is a lot of intra and both inter-ethnic conflicts, and I don't think more nationalism is the way to go. I see that as the imperial standpoint. It's ultimately going to end up backfiring. That's all I have to say about that.
All right, well, thanks for answering that question. We just got a bunch of some questions from the audience, so I'm going to go in the order that Silas gave us here. So the first one's from, I'm going to butcher a bunch of names, Ala Gadasik. The question is, something that further enriches this narrative is the increased rhetoric of admiration for the despotism of China. I think they're referring to Dr. Gill's point about China. So something that further enriches this narrative is the increased rhetoric of admiration for the despotism of China and its efficient handling of Chinese, followed by rueful remarks about how this kind of authoritarian response, oh my gosh, just lost this chat's going fast. Followed by rueful remarks about how this kind of authoritarian response will not work in the liberal West. Of course, these double binaries are part of the racist rhetoric, but I found that I haven't seen this kind of popular fetishization of authoritarianism before, if in a while. So I think this raises questions about increasingly what are the solutions for the pandemic, right? And there seems to be more desire for authoritarian or increased power by governments to control different liberties and freedoms of people. So there seems to be that tension. I think that's an important thing that we should talk about, especially as we're trying to parse out sort of the social effects of the pandemic, right? Which is this kind of anti-Asian racism, for example, and other kinds of isms, but also the real sort of life-threatening reality of the pandemic. And so what are governments supposed to do? What do you think about this admiration for maybe more increased government power? And how do we, if the United States is a democracy or a liberal democracy, how does it deal with sort of this increased desire for authoritarianism?
I have some thoughts on this if anybody else, can I jump in?
Sure.
Yeah. So I think first of all, I would agree with maybe if I can get the spirit of the question, I don't know how helpful it is necessarily to fall into these distinctions between authoritarianism and a liberal West, because again, these are often founded in a distinction that has deep kind of imperial roots. Now, the reason why I'm saying this is in a lot of the early coverage in China around the COVID, right? It was always, oh, look at how China is curtailing liberties. Look at how it is engaging in authoritarian practices. Now, there were other measures such as immense mobilization of health workers in Wuhan, right? Which was not, which has not even translated into kind of the West, the public health response, the language of a people's war against the virus, which is reminiscent of earlier kind of moments after the Chinese Revolution, which speaks to, I think, Alan, your question around what can be done to address the pandemic, right? You're seeing not necessarily an authoritarian versus liberal kind of debate, right? But a question of what role the state should play in relation to capital, right? So you're seeing in China and even South Korea and other East Asian states, or even in Germany as compared to other more, say, aggressively capitalist states, that the state is able to discipline capital into producing certain goods, right? So we see here in the US, Trump kept saying, I don't want to force industries to produce ventilators. I don't want to force them to produce certain goods because we don't want to be like Venezuela. We don't want to nationalize our industries, right? So the debate about the response to the pandemic may get obscured in this authoritarian versus liberal frame, right? And I guess maybe to keep going with that, like, one can emphasize that the US is already quite authoritarian in its relationship to incarcerated peoples, right? Being the most incarcerated society on earth, it's kind of strange to talk about a liberal democracy with probably historically the most incarcerated people per capita, especially racialized, that we can think of in recent memory. But more broadly, I think it's posing questions around what should be the relationship between the state and capital in both, and how do we understand that relationship in both the causes of the crisis and addressing it going forward, right? So yeah, those are some initial thoughts with that.
I just want to briefly, if I could.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, certainly. I mean, Governor of New York, Andrew Cuomo, is using, prison labor to basically slap the NYS sticker on the hand sanitizers that are produced. Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of things, but to answer that question, I don't think it's, I mean, to, refer to a sociologist of empire, Julian Go, I mean, the US is a declining empire. I mean, I just read an article right before this about how the UN wants to make its own global currency and get rid of Federal Reserve because the US dollar is declining. So that's one of the things that we do need to focus on. And that's precisely what makes this precarity so visible and so salient for particularly working white folks. And as W.B. Du Bois articulated, and later Roediger, there's a psychological wage to whiteness, especially exacerbated by the way that COVID has ravaged the current U.S. economy, current world economy. So I mean, there is a lot at that, but I mean, you have to be looking at it in terms of, and I don't mean to pose value neutrality, but we really have to be using reflexivity about like what position do we stand in relation to China, in relation to their authoritarianism, because we were late on all these responses, all these austerity measures caught effectively what could have prevented now thousands of deaths. So I mean, that's what I have to elaborate on, that is that we have to look at things in terms of what we have done critically as the US as a declining empire state, what precisely is a failing, and what precisely are the sentiments that are being mobilized for political gains here. So that's what I have to say on it. Thank you.
All right. Yeah, that was I think some of the points that you all raised about sort of these geopolitical or these very trans-governmental, these very global bodies that are deciding all the fates of all of us in our communities. It seems so out of reach, right? I think a lot of times. So all these things about the Federal Reserve, about global capitalism, all these things. Sometimes it does feel we're so alienated from those kinds of decision making. I think so. There's a question here in the chat from Nisat Soon. They ask, as an organizer who has fought for racial equality for over a decade in the US, myself and some colleagues are interested in organizing a solidarity campaign across POC communities. What are your ideas, suggestions in regards to this, and will you join us? So I think the spirit of this question is interesting because of the way that they're asking some of the speakers to reflect on some of the concrete things we can do in our communities, and especially considering sort of that we're all sort of have the problem of social distancing, right? Sort of this obstacle of that. So what are some things that, and I think Michelle had already mentioned some of these things that we can do in our families and our communities and things that we can do. I'm just curious what you all are doing and what you all can kind of envision concretely how we can engage with these kinds of things that seem to be so out of reach, these sort of centers of power that seem to be so out of reach.
I have something to say on this specific topic that I prepared, if it is okay.
I'm sorry, Michelle, did you have something to say, or? Sorry, okay.
Oh, you're good. Sorry.
Maybe I'll come back to you just because you did mention some stuff about, I mean, and the orgs that you work with. It'd be great to hear what you're all working on. But yeah, sorry, Jungwon. Yeah, if you had something to say, please.
So I think, so I'm a sociologist studying race and affect. And that's been the, if you will, like the new paradigm of studying race and thinking about race and conceptualizing race, how we think about race. And I think precisely affect and emotions and fear, and this is at the heart of what's happening right now and what we're trying to discuss, which is precisely the anti-Asian sentiments, the yellow peril trope being rearticulated. These are emotional devices that are being used. So to borrow from social movement scholar Deborah Gould, who was herself a participant in the New York's ACT UP movement, and in a similar crisis, a similar epidemiological crisis that we're looking at as today, the only way to mobilize or counter these sentiments that exist, that seem so out of reach, to do that on a micro individual level, I think one of it is reaching out, and one of that is using the same devices that it is being articulated through, or is fueling, which is emotions. You need to have empathy. We need to start empathizing each other. We need to make allyship more readily available through emotionality. And now, what poses a great challenge is that we can't have, we're all, you know, Brady Bunch boxed in like this. It's impossible to do a physical collision. So it'd be a matter of, I mean, how far can technology take us in terms of movement mobilization through, that is, empathy. I think those are the challenges, but those are the possibilities.
I'd also just like to say that as someone who's part of an Asian organization, under a student organization that deals with other like LASO and BAC, definitely other organizations, I would ask that we do reach out to those communities, but also coming to the understanding that obviously what is happening to Asian Americans, whether they're physical attacks or verbal attacks, obviously those are something that we are experiencing more frequently now as of the times, but just to remind ourselves that Asian Americans do carry some sort of level of privilege in this country, and understanding that privilege in terms of how other minority groups have pretty much suffered within the same range of like being attacked for how you look, or being attacked or feeling unsafe, or that you might be targeted. These are very like pretty similar experiences that other minority groups have, and I would just encourage Asian Americans not to minimize how those people have experienced that, and how those groups have been making extreme strides in order to stop those, which I think goes into context of how Asian Americans, when reaching out to those communities for their support, understand that the level of privilege that we also hold in terms of that, we should also recognize. And that, I think, really matters in the response that we have to certain communities, especially in the fact that a lot of communities have said that Asian Americans benefit from model minority being the golden standard, being upheld above those other specific communities. And recognizing those privileges, I think, is really important for our community in order to mobilize, because obviously, although it is very difficult, I would say that reaching out and understanding and coming to terms of that, of having empathy and stuff like that, is also understanding that people do have less privileges than we do, obviously. So yeah.
Great. So there's just a bunch of questions. So I'll just move on to the next one. The next one is actually, I think it kind of touches on what we were just mentioning, and maybe what Jung-Won was mentioning about intersectionality. So the question from this, I think, an anonymous person says, do you all think Trump and other political and economic leaders are vilifying Asians to distract them from the ill effects of late-stage capitalism on the US population, such as low pay, lack of access to healthcare, nutritious food, and I assume there's a laundry list of things there. And I think that's important to think about. It's not just simply about, you know, racial prejudice, harassment, racial rhetoric, but actually how race intersects with all these other, you know, questions about how vulnerable, how different communities are more vulnerable, precarious, or more subject to harm through different access to healthcare, through food security or insecurity, and other things. How would you suggest that we, you know, think about sort of beyond the pandemic, I guess, you know, how do we continue on living, you know, having to engage with these kinds of intersectional questions? or what's the importance of thinking about it as it intersects with economic issues, or specifically economic issues?
Well, I just want to quickly, go ahead, Dr. Gill.
Yeah, I was just going to say I entirely agree that those are some of the points I tried to make in my initial comments, is that there's very clearly a failure of the contemporary system of capitalism in the United States and globally right now in addressing the crisis we find ourselves in, right? Like it's shocking and incredibly cruel, right? You've already heard about people who have died for a lack of insurance, right? You hear about in California and Michigan and elsewhere, but this has already played out, right? You see, whether Democrat or Republican, the party machinery that upholds the political elements of capitalism in the United States has unified around these kind of really inexplicably cruel policies of defending pharmaceutical and health sectors that refuse to, that profit off of illness, right? And that's happening right now. You have Trump doing repeated press conferences trying to uphold the virtues and superiority of capitalism, right? So you'll have the Target CEO and the Walmart CEO and all these folks standing next to him, trying to emphasize the power of private capital to get us out of this kind of predicament when it's clearly failing and it can't do so. Like, how is it that there's such a lack of supplies? How does the United States not have industrial capacity to address this, right? What has happened under neoliberalism? These are questions that we are not able to get to. And then at the same time, Alan, I just wanted to add on to something here. We cannot lose sight of the cruelty of the American state right now in intensifying sanctions against Iran, in seeking to punitively attack Venezuela in this context, and continuing to uphold the siege of Gaza. And so we need to have an internationalist kind of dimension here too. And the constant vilification of China and the emphasis on anti-Chinese racism obscures also the role that the US state is playing in intensifying suffering of people in this crisis at this moment, right? And just as a part of this, again, Andrew Cuomo has been celebrated in New York for his response, right, in another register, but he just cut funding to Medicaid, right? They just pushed that through right now. So where is the space for us to have this conversation about the failing of the system, right? Instead, our attention is being directed elsewhere. So I would agree with the spirit of the question for sure.
If I can elaborate a bit on the intersectional matters. Again, I want us to think about really how the existing, and if you will, the triracial hierarchy in the United States function. That is whites at the top, honorary whites, if you will, in the middle, and the collective black at the bottom. And this racial hierarchy is mediated by precisely what Claire Jean Kim calls racial triangulation of Asian Americans. That is often we are portrayed in a way that is model minority. And this is actually to disenfranchise, precisely what Dr. Gill says, I mean, this is separate and, divide and conquer kind of strategy. And I mean, so we really have to think about, look back to precisely the civil rights movement. What happened then? What did the Asian activists do then? And particularly, there have been articles and instances where Asian women are often the target of these covert to overt. I mean, on March 13th, there was literally a stabbing that took place at a Sam's Club, an Asian American family. We have to think about who the most vulnerable is, but we also have to, at the same time, think about, like who are the most vulnerable, and then how is the racial hierarchy maintained? And on top of that, really, I mean, Trump is doing, and his administration is doing pretty much everything to distract everybody from focusing on the point that they've utterly failed to secure biodefense. They've utterly failed to, I mean, they've had so many chances to intervene. It's their failure. And I do understand that there's a deeper connection between the scapegoat, but the scapegoating, who are the most vulnerable? What is the immediacy in terms of how we deal with this? that's a productive conversation that I think I hope to get out of this as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think I appreciate how people have been very thoughtful about trying to bring in the ways that Asian American, it's not just about Asian American rights, but it is about all these other, economic justice. It's about rights for, in terms of women, and in terms of gender-based sexuality, ability, the elderly, all these different ways that we have to think about who's being affected by this. Also, I mean, I think one thing that gets left out is that a lot of undocumented people, especially within the Asian American or Asian community, is also being, they don't have access to health care. They don't have access to these different, things that the stimulus is supposed to provide, all these things that the state is supposed to provide. Those who are, invisible to the state, or at least trying to avoid the state, they cannot access those things. And what do we do within the APIDA community for those who are undocumented or who are on different kind of legal standing, right? And I think some of the issues that y'all have raised, there's a couple questions. Sorry, I'm going to skip into it just because I think it segs well with sort of, there is a call for coalition building, as Jungwon was saying, as you all have been sort of gesturing to this idea that it's not just about Asian American, it's about, other POCs, but other, as one question here says from Falana Kwan, asks, while violence against Asian Americans is not new, it has not been a narrative as closely tied as the narrative of the Black and Brown experiences, as Asian Americans are now experiencing more gazes that perceive them as threats. What do you say to those who question why Black and Brown communities should come to the defense when these communities have historically butted heads? And also something related is from Cheryl Myung. In terms of university settings, but also others, how can we deal with the hierarchy of oppression, as Jungwon just mentioned, rhetoric wherein POC push back on what is, in this context, only perceived severity of the current situation, and the majority is either participatory or naive? How can there be better awareness promoted around psychological trauma in the historical context that is as robust as any other marginalized group? So I think what they're asking is, how do you deal with that sort of those inherent tensions between coalition building with other POCs, people of color, communities of color, but at the same time recognize what these kinds of hierarchies, the different histories of racialization that has shaped those different communities, right? And the kind of privileges that come with it.
I think one important response, I think we can't run away from histories of tension within different racialized kind of communities. But I think it is also important, one way to counter this is there are relations of solidarity between communities that are often held to only have butted heads, right? I'm thinking about, when we think about the history of Black radicalism in the United States, right? And how deeply this was informed and inspired by Maoism, right? There's an article by Robin D.G. Kelly called Black Like Mao, and it's talking about the relationship that the Panthers had and the inspirations they took from the Chinese Revolution. And even you have somebody like W.E.B. Du Bois, traveling to China, and those are often kept out of our discussions of Du Bois or discussions of the Panthers, right? So there are, and I'm seeing a Grace Lee Boggs kind of, yeah, I would agree with that comment there that just flashed up. But there's histories of solidarity that we can also tap into to contrast with. But I think maybe it can also allow for a moment of coming to terms for a history of kind of, as it was called, butting heads, or if there has been a neglect of solidarity from, let's say, the Asian American community, if that is felt, that can maybe be opened up and addressed in a crisis moment such as this. But I think there are histories of also solidarity that can be tapped into, right, in opposition.
Right. So, yeah, I mean, I think the chat has presented so much good stuff. Like it's really, and but the problem is we're actually running out of time. We're gonna have to wrap it up now. For some final thoughts and sort of final takeaways from our invited speakers here. But the chat will be here for, we have a transcript of it. So I think all of those really thought-provoking questions about Japanese American concentration camps, about the sort of tensions between different POC communities, the coalition building, the question of settler colonialism and Native Americans, what is the relationship between, you know, Asian migrants and immigrants to that. I think those are really rich, robust questions, and I hope we can tackle that. If not us, like y'all are doing that in your organizations, in your different, you know, community, different communities, different spaces, right? So this is obviously just part of the conversation. This is not the end. But as this event does have an event beginning and ending, we're going to just finish up with some takeaways, some final thoughts that the speakers would like to share with us as we wrap
Alan?
up. What's that?
It's Silas.
Yeah.
So there's been some questions on the chat about whether the recording will be made available to people later. And so I'm wondering what's the best way for people to look for follow-up information about when this content might be available, or should they reach out through Nina, or what should people be on the lookout for?
Right, so the video and the reading list will be available through the ACE site, through the ACE Center Facebook site. We'll also make sure, I'll talk with Dr. Ha about maybe sending out this email with the links and everything for all those interested. We're just trying to get this collectively made, the reading list too. But yeah,
Yes.
the video, yeah, sorry.
Oh, I was going to say, Dr. Ha just posted to the chat that information will be posted to the ACE Facebook page. So that's Asian Cultural Engagement Center at Virginia Tech. That's the group name for the Facebook page. Thanks.
Yes, that was definitely going to be, thanks Alice. So that was going to be one of the slides on the PowerPoint, but we'll get just the final thoughts before we wrap up here. I think Dr. Mar had to take off. So Michelle, Vikram, and Jungwon, if you will.
My final thoughts are pretty much just to be cautious of what kind of news you're sharing and the ways that you can help Asian American students, especially in the fact that like sharing your news articles or just like being, I guess, an ally to what their situations might look like and what scenarios that they might encounter and the burdens that they share as being Asian Americans during this time. Thank you.
Is it me? Okay. I just want to thank everybody and all the panelists. It was a privilege to be on here because we're all going through this together, and the society is interdependent at this point. And I just want to make it clear that, you know, I mean, there's a difference between tolerance and complicity. I wasn't gonna launch into this whole thing about Hannah Arendt, but I'm not gonna do that because that would be rude and take up. But don't be complicit, because that's the same as, I mean, and I'm sure Michelle and everybody on the panel articulated this point. But we're a whole. And I don't usually say this because I'm a pretty negative person, but yeah. So this is a start of a conversation. This was more than needed. Thank you all for coming and participating. Very grateful to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, I will co-sign everything that co-presenters have said, Michelle and Jungwon. I think the really important points to continue to offer kind of solidarity and to look out for those who are kind of coming under attack right now. I think also as some closing thoughts, we have to, as hard as this is, and it's going to continue to get harder, both in terms of intensifying racism and just the general kind of crisis we find ourselves in, right? But we have to keep reminding ourselves that these crises have been long existing, even before now, right? So like, I know we're talking about anti-Asian racism, but the crisis of incarceration and the question of how deeply the coronavirus and its spread has been most intense in prisons, right? And this is obviously a very racialized question as well. But the work that people would have done on abolition and decarceration, right? To have these conversations in relation to those is incredibly pressing. There must be a demand to release people from prison right now, especially when you think of how many people are held for bail violation or for not being able to make bail, right? I think there was a question around Native American, the presence of Native American and Native American rights. Again, those are pre-existing crises that are only being intensified right now. You're seeing news about action that Trump is taking against indigenous peoples in various tribes. Other crises that have been pre-existing and are being intensified right now is the brutality of the way in which poor people are killed in this country for lacking insurance, right? So now as we respond to the crisis, right now, the response is being right now a massive theft of resources upwards, right? We're having a huge corporate consolidation through all these stimulus packages. And the only way we can respond because of the challenges of organizing in a time of crisis is through mutual aid practices in our communities, which is still very challenging. But in organizing in these spaces, it is important that we start to ask different questions to our neighbors, to our coworkers and so forth, right? What is this crisis really about, right? There may be there might be emphasis on attacking China or racialized discourses, but it's about the collapse also of a system that was already in crisis and the brunt of which was borne by oppressed peoples, right? And I think hopefully this can open up some space for us to start to, really address these crises that were already there and cultivate different relations and to start to really hopefully wrestle power away from the banking class, right? To wrestle power away from Wall Street and the concentrated kind of economic ownership that is plaguing this country and the world. So yeah, thank you everyone. And maybe we can do it again soon.
All right, thank you again, Michelle, Jungwon, Vikram, Dr. Ko, Dr. Mar. Thank you everyone. Thank you to Silas, Jackie and Nina. Yeah, just parting words. I really appreciate all of y'all for coming out. I appreciate the chat for all the thought-provoking questions. As everyone is saying, if you don't like organizations, you can just start your own organization, just as long as you're organizing. I think that's an important thing to think about. Yeah, so just respect your elders, respect the youth, respect your ancestors. So I'm going to put up the information here at the end, and y'all can just maybe continue on chatting for a bit, and we'll probably end, maybe in 5-10 minutes. All right, thank you again. Take care.